We're talking astrology, mythical penises, and Egyptian pyramids hidden inside the Hollywood Hills in this week's episode of Haunted Hollywood Hour. Writer and historian Karina Wilson is back on the podcast this week to tell us about astrologer Linda Goodman and her theory that there is a pyramid inside a certain hill beside the Cahuenga Pass, and it contains genitalia of a god. I'm dying to hear all about this, but welcome, Karina.
Hi, it's good to be back after our cemetery sojourn the other week.
Yeah, I love all the wisdom you have to share with us, and I'm so excited every week I get to talk to you. So let's learn about Linda Goodman. She's an astrologer who was born in 1925. She's an Aries, that's what I found out.
And the story has it that she was of Melungian stock, which is an old word that was a slur in the 20th century, but has since been reclaimed by people. And it basically means that she was of mixed race stock. But if you know anything about the horrifically racist laws of the mid 20th century, that did have an impact. It's the one drop rule. Although she passed as white, and I think her family passed as white. There was, by claiming her Melungian heritage, she was always identifying herself with the marginalized. And she had an awareness of how the way that we treat each other, and particularly the way that people treated each other during her lifetime, is not the way we should be treating each other. And that, I think, developed. She began her career as a journalist, and she had 5 children, 3 of whom died in infancy, which is just catastrophic. And then she started a job as a radio announcer, where she used the name Linda. Yeah, Love Letters from Linda, where she read out love letters and built a kind of a community. And she changed her name. She was actually born Mary Alice Kemery. And then she changed her name to Linda. And then her second husband who worked for the radio station, a radio announcer called Sam Goodman. And she took his name. And I think that the name is a really cool name if you believe in being the best person that you can be.
I'm just really curious, what is the attitude towards spirituality in the 1920s, 1930s? Because one thing that I'm pinging on is, in the 1920s, at least, that was the rise of Amy Semple McPherson, who was the first radio evangelist.
I think she would have spent her childhood and teens, obviously, before television sets became commonplace in houses. And I think we've kind of lost sight of how important radio was. It was the only form of home entertainment other than reading. And, the famous example that everybody quotes is Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio play. But there were soap operas, there were news shows, there were variety shows. People would sit by the radio and listen. And radio, we're doing this podcast. We are the descendants of those radio shows, because radio and just audio only is incredibly intimate. You can sit and listen and lose yourself in stories, in other worlds, in other people's lives. It's just very kind of intimate. It's somebody whispering in your ear.
Yeah, telling you a story at the campfire.
Yeah. And, the popularity of podcasts now is we can link it directly to the popularity of radio shows then. Preachers used radio shows because it was a way of massively expanding their congregation, because even into the 50s and 60s, to do a live broadcast on television every Sunday was prohibitive. But to actually do a radio preachers, that was easy, but much more easily done. But I think the more important thing in terms of spirituality is that a lot of the things that we associate with spiritual practice now, like astrology or yoga, were simply not available to regular people. People just didn't know about them. If you were an early wave hippie on Mount Shasta, or if you were a Aleister Crowley devotee, or if you were really into your kind of esoteric spiritual practice that was hidden from regular people, then you knew about astrology. Then you knew about the influence of Eastern thought. The word occult actually means hidden. And so we've brought a lot of these kind of things out into the light. But in the first half of the 20th century, for certain, good Americans were Christians, and they did not have any contact with these ways of thinking. But that all starts to fall apart in the late 60s. And that's around the time that Linda moves to New York in 1963 and really starts to study astrology. Like she really is fascinated by drawing up people's charts and figuring out how your natal chart can shape your whole life, and figuring out the difference between signs. And that was her life's work. And she was poised to bring astrology into the mainstream, because at that time, you have the flower power children, you have a whole generation who are turning on the ways of their parents and their grandparents, and they're looking for something new. And that bleeds into the 1970s, where you have all kinds of people who go, the old ways of thinking have not worked for us. That's when we get, huge strides in feminism. We've got post-civil rights era. You've got a big wave of cultural and philosophical change where people go, well, actually, these old rigid ways of thinking and these old patterns that, rigid gender stereotypes, class stereotypes, we want a different world. And a lot of the so-called me generation of the 1970s, they got into psychology and astrology as a way of trying to kind of understand themselves, and as Linda modeled throughout her whole life, trying to be a better person. And I know you're a big astrology aficionado, so maybe you can speak to that a little bit more.
I took a look at some of her interviews, and I haven't read her actual book. I just read like a little bit of her writing, and it's very simplified. Astrology is a very complex science, really, that goes back thousands of years, and with its origins in the Hellenistic period. And so a lot of the documents from the Hellenistic period weren't actually translated until about 15 years ago. So she's kind of going off of kind of an oral tradition of astrology that's been passed down in the West for hundreds of years, based on kind of a few source documents, but not a whole lot. So she's bringing a very simplified version of astrology, which actually is very useful, because in the 70s, if people aren't used to thinking about things symbolically and astrologically, you can't just like project on everyone, okay, geometry tells you everything that you need to know about everything that will happen in your life. Because people would be like, what, how? And there's like thousands of rules and you have to use math. But she's like, the month you were born tells us about your personality. And that's okay, that's very simple. It's a little oversimplified because that's not exactly how it works. But I think she's able to get people's foot in the door, because as someone who is interested in astrology as a kid, I got into it because I found out I was a Virgo and I wanted to know what being a Virgo meant. And so I started with my sun sign. It causes a little bit of confusion because there's a lot of people who think, oh, my sun sign tells me about my personality. And then when someone's like, but I don't act like a Virgo, well, that's because your whole chart is actually about the events that will happen in your life, not necessarily your sign. And then you start getting into like, well, this is what's actually going on. But I think she introduced a whole mainstream movement of people dipping their toes into it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way sun signs is very humorous. She, for instance, she goes through all the Peanuts characters and guesses what their signs might be. It's very playful, but it is very simplistic. But she divides it up into kind of like the Aries male and the Aries female, and it's based on some of the more rigid gender types of her day. But she totally believed in equality, and she wanted astrology to be a way of people, I think, being more accepting of themselves. That for each sun sign, you have strengths and weaknesses, and that you have to own your weaknesses as well as celebrate your strengths. And as you say, it's a tool, as as I said, psychology was also a tool at the time where people would have themselves, they would go into deep therapy, deep talk therapy, and they would also use knowledge of their astrological chart to try and figure out what they could be trying to change about themselves and what they should be working with as opposed to against. And then her second book is about the people that you're compatible with, love signs. So it's know yourself and know the people that you're compatible with and know who you should steer a long, long way away from and who you might actually have a chance of making it with. So it's hugely
very, very simplified, because if anyone's like, I'm an Aries, I could never get along with a Pisces or whatever. I'm like, no, it's the person. It's not the sign.
Yeah.
It's the main thing you want to ask yourself is this person you're in a relationship with able to, manage their emotions and empathize and be a kind person and validate your feelings and all of that. It doesn't matter what sign they are or what their chart looks like. The chart tells you what events will happen in their life, but not necessarily who they've chosen to be as a person. But it's really great that I think she opened the door to people coming from this generation that was very rigid in this is what you have to be a good man in society. This is what you have to be a good woman in society. And instead saying like, here are all the different types of people that you could be. And all these different types of people bring different gifts and different experiences, and maybe we should celebrate all these different types of people. Okay, so she had a background as a speechwriter in the civil rights movement for civil rights leaders. Right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, she was the speechwriter for Whitney Young, who was an American civil rights leader in the 60s. And he really spearheaded the fight for Black people in industry and government service. He wanted equal rights in the workplace and advocated for spending government money on solving racial problems, which wouldn't get him very far in the current administration.
Right.
And he was, he was based in, it's probably Virginia, that's the connection. And yeah, but I mean, the fact that she was a speechwriter early on suggests that she had this lifelong belief in equality, in gender equality, in civil rights.
Yeah, and getting a message out there, using words, breaking down paradigms that have existed in an unfair and unequal system that she's growing up in and living in.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, her own racial heritage may have made her more keenly aware of how pointless, stupid, and cruel racial discrimination is and how arbitrary it is. That, I mean, especially the one drop.
What was it that propelled Linda to fame?
Well, going back to what you just said, I think it was her eloquence, and she was just a really fun writer. She wrote poetry. She used astrology to analyze, describe celebrities of the day. And she generated a whole kind of spirit. There was no online then, obviously, but she created a spiritual self-help community. And her books sold millions and millions of copies. And she wrote solidly for 20 years. And, the rights for her books also sold for millions of dollars. But she gave away her money almost as fast as she made it. There were periods of her life where she was flat broke, or she was waiting for an advance to come through, or waiting for royalties to come through, because she would just want to make people's lives better and would spend money on buying them cars or fridge freezer or whatever it was that she thought they needed. And
we also come to learn that she spends her money in very strange ways to some people, but we're going to get into that. What was the cultural impact of her book?
It was huge. And I remember as a very small girl seeing copies of Sun Signs on my mom's friends' coffee tables and them talking about it as something exciting, because it explained why their husband was like their husband. One conversation I remember. And it became the cool thing, particularly amongst the Hollywood community, because as if you spend any time here, most successful Hollywood people, their career is based on some very peculiar aspect that, is it luck? Is it fate?
It's just like the random things happen. And that person happens to be in the right moment at the right time, and they just propel to
people become megastars, and some people don't. And there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason to it. It's this strange sort of mystical thing where you kind of, people get the finger of God touches them and suddenly they're exalted. And so much is up to chance as well. Like you say, being in the right place at the right time, or being, talking to the right person in line next to you, or going to the right party. And I think that most, this is imposter syndrome, that a lot of very famous people are very aware of how lucky they are, and that, it happened to be them, but it could have been the person they were standing next to. So the idea that astrology might play a part in that, I think, became very popular in the late 60s, thanks to Linda. And it's still popular now. Like, I know so many Hollywood people who eagerly await Susan Miller's horoscopes at the beginning of the month, although she never quite gets them out at the beginning of the month these days. And because
Susan Miller was the one who got 2020 wrong. Everyone was like, 2020 is going to be awful. And Susan Miller was like, 2020 is going to be an amazing time. So the astrology is always right. The interpretation can sometimes be wrong.
Yeah. The Chinese astrologers were they were pounding the warning drums about 2020 in late 2019. They're going, it's going to be a bad one. And it was, of course.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that COVID first hit around Chinese New Year.
During the Saturn-Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in late 2019. That was the thing. I could go on in the astrology of COVID-19, which was really fun and terrible. But I definitely found that in my workplace, which is a Hollywood-centered workplace, that all of my coworkers are into astrology. We talk about astrology constantly.
Yeah, and everybody knows when Mercury's in retrograde, and people will, if you're saying you're going through a bad time, they're like, "When's your Saturn return?" And it's the lingua franca in Hollywood is astrology, and that's pretty much down to Linda, because she, she spent time here. She was really good friends with people like Steve McQueen and Ali McGraw. People liked having her around because she was a good person, not good man, good person.
Yeah.
And she, I think from what I've read about her, she was authentic. Like, she was genuinely caring. She was one of those people that genuinely lit up the room, and she was very attractive, but not for superficial Hollywood reasons. She walked into a room and there was just a kind of a spiritual glow and peace about her that people gravitated towards.
It wasn't all sparkly and wonderful, because she experienced a lot of terrible trauma in her life. Something terrible happened with her daughter.
The circumstances were that Sally, her daughter, had just had a really good summer working at Hackmatack Playhouse in Maine. And that season finished and she went back to New York. At the beginning of December 1973, the police were called because there was a horrible smell emanating from her apartment. Now, what happened then is very much open to interpretation. There are contradictory police reports about the height and the weight of the woman that was found, whether there was blood or not found in the apartment. And apparently she'd drunk a vast quantity of liquor and had also had a massive overdose of barbiturates. So this body's found, and there are all kinds of weird circumstances around her father, Linda's ex, identifying the body. And again, it was suggested that this woman might actually have been black as opposed to white.
Oh, wow.
And there was just chaos in the apartment. That there was the mattress was soaked in blood. It looked like somebody had bled to death, but that wasn't the body that they found. So it was incredibly consistent, incredibly weird. And there was all kinds of theories connecting Sally to possibly knowing too much about Watergate. And if you know anything about this period of history, I think it runs from the Kennedy assassination to the end of the Vietnam War. People point the fingers at all kinds of nefarious deeds going on that the government government operatives were arranging assassinations, were involved in heinous cover-ups. And that was just the kind of way of thinking in the early 1970s. Everybody was out to get you. And Linda believed that, first of all, she believed that Sally was alive and she'd been kidnapped. And then she gradually, over the course of many years, began to accept that she was dead. And she used astrology. She said that as an astrologer, she couldn't predict death, but she could see non-death. And she looked at Sally's chart and said that there's no way that she was dead yet.
I know that experience of like being an astrologer and wanting to see certain things in the chart. I think that's where human interpretation can be questionable.
Yeah, this is why we need transparent, organized police processes, because cops do mess up and they do bodge reports, and they don't necessarily make sure that all the information is consistent. And if you do have a very unexpected, unexplained death, any anomaly, the grieving family will latch onto it. And again, a distance of 50 years, we can't say what was true about Sally's death or what wasn't, but Linda was really traumatized by it and spent a lot of money on private investigators. What she wanted to hear was that Sally was still alive, and there would be unscrupulous people who basically told her what she was paying for.
That's so sad.
And even 7 years later, she's still receiving tips about Sally living in Arizona.
Oh, wow.
7 years after the death.
There were really weird things, like the autopsy stated the death was 6 days ago. However, forensic pathologists studied the autopsy report and stated that the partially mummified body would have had to have been dead for 3 to 4 weeks. One, I would love to figure out who those forensic pathologists were. Were they hired by Linda, telling her what was what? There's this very strange conspiracy idea about this boat called Star Quest that was like a Epstein sort of situation where there were sex parties on this boat and they would get politicians to be involved, and then they could have blackmail them. And that potentially Linda said that maybe Sally knew about this, and that was why she was either killed or disappeared. And I'm sure it was really heartbreaking for Linda, who had already had 5 kids at that point die early in infancy.
Yeah, I mean, just heartbreaking. And because she was an optimist, she wanted to believe that her daughter was alive. So she clung to anything that let her believe it. And yeah, as I say, there's just so many inconsistencies in the reporting around the death that you do have to wonder what was going on. It's not completely implausible that an attractive young actress like Sally, apparently this is a period of time where Linda herself was waiting for royalties, so she didn't have a lot of money. Sally had done a summer season, but this is December, so maybe her money had run out. You can understand why an actress might go to a party on a boat if somebody's offering to pay her. So it's not sex work per se. It happens a lot here in the hills. If you want to go out and pick up models or actresses and pay them to attend a party, so it makes the party, then there's always people available for that. Most of the time it's completely legitimate. But if Sally had been scooped up by somebody shady,
politicians, trying to blackmail someone,
without them realizing that she had a famous and influential mother, they thought she was just another, because they didn't have the same last name. Yeah. Sally used the last name Snyder.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's still, many people are investigating this whole disappearance, death situation to this day, 50 years later. And what was Linda's relationship to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel?
So that's just where she liked to stay. And it was the Hollywood Roosevelt. I stayed there myself, been to many, many events there. And you've done an episode on it, haven't you? Yes. Yeah. It's a lovely hotel, and that was where she stayed. She normally lived up in Colorado. She liked to live a rural life, and her main home was in Cripple Creek, Colorado. But when she came to town, she stayed at the Roosevelt.
And so I'm guessing if you're like high up on the Roosevelt, I've never been but you can see out to the Hollywood Hills and you could see across.
Yes, and you could certainly do that before they built the shopping center. So for those outside Los Angeles, the Roosevelt Hotel is on the south side of Hollywood Boulevard. And the block kind of facing it, kind of catty corner, is where the famous Hollywood Hotel was until 1956, when it was criminally knocked down. And they built the new complex. So the Roosevelt is actually just across the road from the famous Grauman's Chinese Theatre. And next to that was the Hollywood Hotel. So from the 50s through to when they built that shopping precinct, which was probably the 80s, I imagine, you actually had a view up the Cahuenga Pass. You had a view into the Hollywood Hills. And one of the things that you could see is the so-called Hollywood Cross.
And where did that cross come from?
Now, the Hollywood Cross has a very storied history. It was originally created by the woman who funded the Hollywood Bowl. Now, the Hollywood Bowl is a world-famous amphitheater, and it was originally built by Christine Wetherell Stevenson, she was an heiress. And in 1919, she helped pay the money towards building this amphitheater because, like many people who lived in the Hollywood area at the time, she was a devout Christian, and she wanted it to be a venue for outdoor plays based on the life of Jesus Christ. But because she wasn't the sole owner, and there are limitations, separation of church and state, about how many and what kind of religious pageants you can put on, she actually had a row with the Hollywood Bowl people, and she built another theatre, which is now the Ford Theatre, across the ravine. And now the Hollywood Bowl and the Ford Amphitheatre have the 101 going between them, the freeway. But at the time, it was just the Cahuenga Pass. It was just a busy road. And she managed to see, I think, one production at the new Pilgrimage Play Theatre, as it was then called. But she died in 1922. And to commemorate her friends and family created a 40-foot high lighted cross on the hill, kind of sort of just, I guess, to the southeast of the theatre as a memorial. And it was originally wooden, and I think 1,800 bulbs. And it was turned on as a way of drawing people's eyes up to the cross and to God when they came for evening performances at the Pilgrimage Play Theatre, at the Ford Amphitheatre, for any services that they went to at the Hollywood Bowl. And it was donated to the county in 1941. And unfortunately, later that year, the fact that this was a focal point, people traveling up and down the Cahuenga Pass could see this lighted cross from a long way away. Apparent Nazis created a swastika on the hillside made of white lime. They outlined with white lime a giant swastika.
And what year was that?
There was an investigation, but nobody was ever arrested. This is in probably August 1941, so just a few months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Oh, wow.
So that hill was obviously a site of conflict. So the values represented by the cross on the top and then the swastika. That cross actually burned down in 1965, and it was replaced by a steel and glass structure. But then there's always been this push-pull about whether the city should pay for the electricity to light it because it's a religious symbol, and that is not allowed under the separation of church and state. And the ACLU actually brought an injunction to prevent city coffers from paying for it. And so other groups it's had a whole process of I think Hollywood Heritage owned it at one point, and it's fallen down, it's been put up. But there's always some church group comes to the rescue. And, in its current form, I think it's been there since the early 90s. And it's beautiful. I mean, you can see it from the Hollywood Bowl. You can see it when you're stuck in traffic on the 101. And it's a landmark and everybody knows it, but very few people really think about it. You know, it's always there glowing.
What happens on New Year's Day, 1970, that begins Linda's quest to learn more about the hill that cross is on?
So Linda at this time is riding high. She's the most famous astrologer in the world. She's very wealthy. And she still opens her hotel room door when there's a knock. And there's a young man standing there who tells her that he is an astral traveler and he has a message for her. That was catnip for her, like to say, I've come a long way through space and time, and I have a message for you. And she described him in star signs as a plump man shaped rather like a Buddha, wearing a snow white turban fastened in the center with a pearl stick pin. So he has a sort of mystical appearance. And they just talk, and they talk and talk and talk and talk. And he tells her that the Hollywood Hills, and in particular that hill underneath the cross, is the sacred resting place of the Egyptian god Osiris's penis. So this is where we get to the divine genitals that may be pumping all kinds of toxic masculinity throughout Hollywood. So why is Osiris's penis separate from Osiris? Now, Osiris, for those Egyptology fact fans among you, was, of course, effectively the sun god. And he spent his time in bitter rivalry with his brother Set, who was the god of darkness and storms and chaos. Set murdered Osiris, chopped him up into 14 pieces and threw him in the Nile. Now, Osiris's sister wife, Isis, put him back together. And this is one of the kind of earliest examples of sort of divine medicine. And she pieced him back together, but she could not find the penis because supposedly a crocodile had eaten it. And some stories say that she used a piece of wood, and some stories say that she used her thumb. She had help from Anubis, the god of embalming, and they used magic to basically resurrect him.
I love it because it's like sign myth. It's like,
yeah, I mean, Osiris, like Jesus, like Dionysus, there's a fondness during that period of history for gods who are resurrected and who go through suffering but are brought back to life somehow. So after his resurrection, he's the gatekeeper to the afterlife. He's the king of the beyond. And somehow his penis was brought to the Hollywood Hills. And so this astral traveler said it was buried in a pyramid-shaped chamber inside that hill. And that meant that hill was sacred. Now, it's interesting to note that the Tongva, they regarded that hill as somehow special and sacred. And that's where the name
is their word. Yeah.
Yeah. Cahuenga is their word for it. It means place of the hill. So they named it specifically as this was something to be marked, something special. And when the bumbling European colonialists come in and stick their cross on the top, perhaps they're acknowledging that this hill is special in some way too. And particularly, as I say, the kind of history of that cross, it gets blown down, put back up, blown down, destroyed. Mm-hmm. It becomes a spiritual site.
Yeah.
And so the astral traveler tells Linda that there's a burial chamber underneath, and that she needs to go on a quest to the mountains. And that's all she really says in her book, Star Signs. She doesn't say very much about it. But from that year onwards, she would always stay in the Roosevelt Hotel in December. And on December the 8th, which is the feast of the Immaculate Conception, Bodhi Day, she would go on a pilgrimage to the cross with a small group of friends. She'd climb up the hill, and who knows what they did there. Then also, the rumor has it that she spent a lot of money, $140,000 in her lifetime, having the hill scanned using the primitive ground penetrating radar that they had at the time. And there are people who say that they saw the images that she obtained. And again, when you regard this story in the context of her all the investigation she did into her daughter's death, it may be that people gave her what she wanted to hear because she was paying for it. But she did seem to discover that there was indeed a pyramid-shaped chamber, hollow chamber inside that hill. And when she died in 1995, there was no evidence of any images amongst her personal effects. They somehow vanished. And again, we get into that whole conspiracy thing. Mm-hmm. When you're conspiracy minded, everything is a conspiracy. But maybe the conspiracies come from somewhere. It's so hard to piece through what might actually be the truth.
I want to dig in the hill, though. I want to dig in the hill and see what happens. Like, I wonder if our phone technology will get so good that we can just use our phone to scan the hill and find out if there's anything inside.
Well, there are all kinds of scanning devices, 3D scanning, that if you could put some kind of probe in, we'd get some images. But it's a really strange story. And it's one of my favorite Hollywood strange stories, because if there is the penis of a mutilated god buried under that hill, that explains a lot about the vibe of Hollywood and the terrible things that have happened in this town that have been based on male sex drive, all the exploitation, there's been so many tragedies. I think the idea that there's this sort of throbbing male member,
especially in the Hollywood Hills, where the Hollywood Hills
influencing some of the horrors that have gone on here. That makes a kind of sense to me.
And you've been to the hill and walked. I have not. So what did you experience when you went up the hill?
I went up there a couple of years ago because I was curious. And that's why I go a lot of different places in LA. And I always feel like my explorations are benign and they're met with a benign energy. But I scrambled on that hill that day, and I was about halfway up. I couldn't find a path. I was scrambling up the side, and I realized I hadn't told anyone where I was going. And it did briefly cross my mind that I might die on the hill, and I would become a Hollywood true story. But thankfully, I made it up there, got some cool photos at the top, and saw the plaques, and stood at the foot of the cross, which is quite imposing, and found my way back down again quite easily. But it's an odd place. There's definitely an energy once you get close.
Well, I definitely want to go with a buddy and do a tarot card reading up there and see what I find out. The only time I really can think of being on foot in the Cahuenga areas, once I tried to ride my bike down Cahuenga, and it was not, the cars there are actively trying to kill you if you're on a bike. And so I realized I made a grave mistake in attempting to do that. But now I'm going to try and head out up on foot and see if I can experience the hill itself and see if I can get any vibe.
Because, we can talk about these nebulous toxic masculine vibes, but Egyptology itself has had a huge influence on
that's true.
The formation of Hollywood. I mean, we have the Egyptian Hotel. There's all kinds of Egypt-influenced buildings scattered around the place. If you go to the Central Library downtown, that is homage to the pyramids. It's a Hollywood and Egypt are strange they're strange bedfellows, but they're bedfellows nonetheless.
And even if you think of the early days of the golden age of Hollywood, the fashions are Egyptian inspired. The film Cleopatra is obviously, there's so many big films that are Egypt inspired. Yeah. The Mummy and everything. And just the permanent structures in Hollywood, the buildings there's so many Egyptian inspired buildings, and just down Hollywood Boulevard, everything within the sight line of that hill, there's Egyptian stuff all over the place.
Yeah. And some of that is because the 1920s generally were Egypt obsessed, because, of course, Howard Carter opens the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 and extracts all these incredible treasures, the likes of which have never been seen in centuries. And it's interesting to note that while Linda's doing her exploration, her ground radar research, there was a second period of Tutmania, because the treasures from the tomb were actually taken on a world tour. And they ended up in the US in the late 70s. I think they were in the UK in 1972, 73. And then they, as I say, they went all over the world. And speaking of Egyptology, I'll say one last thing, which is the piecing together of Osiris is considered potentially the world's oldest recorded neurosurgical operation. And one of the things that comes out of it is the symbol, which is, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, the cross, which is a pillar-like symbol. And this is 3,000 years before Christianity. And it celebrates Osiris because it represents his spine that was pieced together by his sister. And it's a backbone. It is not a million miles away from a cross.
That's fascinating. And so like the Egyptian symbol, that cross for Osiris's backbone looks very similar to like a Christian cross. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean it's more of a kind of pillar. It looks like a human spine if you think of the vertebrae.
I mean, in pagan symbolism, a cross that's really like more like a T. That's like as above, so below. So even before Christianity took the idea of a cross and made it like their symbol, like pagan symbolism used a cross.
I think there's a lot of cross fertilization because when people want to venerate symbols, they want to venerate something that on a deep level they already regard as sacred. And so, you just have variations upon these things. But I think Osiris is often compared to Jesus, even though there's a lot of controversy about how closely they can be compared. So, if Osiris's penis is in there, maybe it doesn't feel too cross about the monument on the glowing monument atop the hill.
And a little synchronicity, I watched Lisa Frankenstein over the weekend, which is a great movie. And a plot line in that is the little boyfriend zombie that comes up out of the grave. He's missing certain body parts. And one of those body parts is a penis. And there's a plot line where she cuts off the penis of a terrible guy and sews it onto her little zombie boyfriend. And it's the Osiris myth coming to Hollywood. And I'm glad I watched that just in time for this podcast, not expecting that was going to be the plot line of our podcast or the movie. But I think it is really interesting how the technology that creates mass images and stories for the world to consume is in Hollywood, where the structures and the buildings are Egyptian style. And one could say possibly that the reason for Egyptian fashion being so popular is, in addition to King Tut's tomb being opened, the imagery from Hollywood being sent around the world, people wanting to copy their favorite movie stars who are wearing these Egyptian fashions and seeing these buildings with Egyptian style. I don't know. There could be a synchronicity, a connection there.
Yeah, it's Jungian cultural consciousness, isn't it? It's sort of shared. And, I think a lot of these symbols do recur across cultures. So I think a lot of the, there are certain shapes that have, like the yoni is always going to have a huge power over all of us for obvious reasons. And there are shapes that recur because they themselves have power. And if you can attach stories to them or your religion to them, that helps you convey your message to your followers.
Yeah.
So you wanted to talk about Linda's chart?
Oh, I did. Yeah, I do have a little picture here of Linda's chart. And we have conflicting stories. So in the Wikipedia article and in a lot of public statements about her birth time is listed as 6:05 a.m. Eastern time, and that puts her as an Aries rising with the sun basically like right on her ascendant. And I did read a source from Linda that I found on the internet that wasn't like a widely publicized source, that she says her birth time is 8:23 a.m. and that she's a Gemini rising. But looking at the Aries rising chart, one, it should be like the symbolism of what she's most famous for, which is sun signs. It's very interesting that the sun is right on her ascendant. So like what she's known for is a book about where the sun is placed. So if we were to use the widely publicized 605 birth time, that makes sense. And also being an Aries rising with an Aries sun, that means that the sun is exalted in Aries, and her purpose in this incarnation is to exalt the sun. And she did that with her book, Sun Signs. So I think that's really interesting. But what is noticeable is that her chart is a day chart. That means the most difficult part of her life is her third house, which has Mars in it. So that deals with early childhood, siblings. Her Mars is somewhat like debilitated because it's being provided for by a retrograde Mercury that is then being provided for in Taurus by a very, very debilitated Venus. And Venus is debilitated because she's in a Mars-ruled sign in Aries, where she doesn't do well in, and where she's combust because she's so close to the sun. So it's like Venus things are very difficult for her. Mercury things are difficult for her. And you think, well, but she's such a good writer that kind of appealed to the masses. I think that really speaks to Jupiter ruling her midheaven in that she's able to get her message out there, but possibly her own thinking and her own reasoning is debilitated in some way. It's unconventional as well. So like Mercury retrograde people can be very unconventional. And Mercury retrograde people can also be very spiritual because Mercury is the psychopomp. It's the gender neutral planet that's able to go between worlds. And when it's retrograde, it's going into the underworld and taking a message from the underworld and carrying it back up to the surface as the psychopomp. So that's really, really interesting. But I kind of am wondering, because she's got this very exalted sun and her North Node is in her fifth house. A fifth house usually rules children. That kind of points to her children are doing good, and her children were not doing good. So I kind of wonder if whatever the source is that said Linda had said that she is a Gemini rising might be correct. I'm going to see if I can change this chart
because I've seen a 1:30 Eastern time.
1:30. Oh, really? So, okay. I am looking at the 8:23, this 8:23 a.m. chart that was in some source that I found that Linda said that was her birth time. And this seems more accurate for that experience of having trouble with her children, because in this chart, that is a Gemini rising that puts the fifth house, which speaks to children, as a Libra. And Libra is ruled by Venus, and the Venus in this chart is very debilitated, and the moon is in there. So that's like, and it's like the moon is opposite the sun, and that also, like, it's a full moon, so it kind of points to endings. That really does, squaring Jupiter. This really does feel like the chart that is more accurate about her difficulties with her children, or her children having a hard time.
I was going to say her physical, she became quite ill towards the end of her life. She had diabetes, and she had a toe and then a leg amputated. So she clearly had issues with the lower part of her body. And some of that was that she refused conventional treatment because she didn't trust it. But also, I think that's what's making me think this chart is more accurate, because Mars in Gemini in the first house is yourself, your body. Gemini rules the parts of your body that are two things, like your two hands, your two legs, your 2 feet. Mars is cutting. So if she herself is experiencing, what did you say? Something with her? So she had a toe amputated and then foot.
Experiencing a foot being amputated late in life, that really speaks to that Mars and Gemini in the first house and being the most difficult part of herself. That puts Mercury in the 12th house, which also speaks to that. The 12th house is called the metacosmos, which is the world between worlds. Mercury retrograde in the 12th house, the psychopomp. Like she's experiencing a completely different way of seeing the world, but also it's called the house of self-undoing. So it can also be where you self-sabotage and where mental illness is an issue and where the choices that you make are things that cause your self-undoing. But still, and putting the sun in the 11th house is like your fame, your fans. And, she becomes famous for writing about the sun. Like that really does make sense more so than the Aries rising chart. I feel like that tells her story a little bit more closely and accurately.
And if she's an Aries sun sign, she's at the beginning of the zodiac. She's an optimist. She hasn't got the lifetimes of cynicism that we Pisces have accrued.
Oh, you're Pisces. I love Pisces. A lot of my favorite celebrities are Pisces.
Yeah. But I think she certainly had that Aries energy that she blundered. She's the ram with her head down, blundering into things and charging on the basis of her beliefs.
And what a lot of Aries get known for is they're always the first to do something. Like, so she's the first to bring astrology into the mainstream. Like they're often like the first to break a record. They're the first to introduce things. Whereas like Pisces are like the ones who take the things that other people have done and perfect it based on their many lifetimes of experience. But what was the other birth time that you found? Okay, so I'm looking at around 1:30 to see if like this might also be a possibility.
And that would be April the 10th.
Oh, it would be April the 10th. That puts her moon in Scorpio, applying to a conjunction with Saturn. Then Jupiter, which rules her 5th house, in the 6th house, which is the house of bad fortune. So we can look at two things that kind of talk to her experience with motherhood. And so the moon applying to Saturn does point to like the humans that she attempts to birth die, because Saturn is kind of the planet of endings and restriction and death. And then, okay, if we look at, 5th house also points to children, and her 5th house is ruled by Jupiter, which is normally a really good planet. But unfortunately, in this chart, Jupiter is in the 6th house, which is called the house of bad fortune. And it's in Capricorn, which is the most debilitated place for Jupiter to ever be. And so that also this chart actually could be something. Although this chart puts Mars in her 11th house, and we do know that she had a lot of fans. So this would more point to like her fans being really mean to her, or the public being very aggressive against her. So this is a possibility. This could be I see this working in a lot of ways. Interesting.
Because she was reclusive, which suggests that she didn't. She let people into her inner circle, but she spent her much of her life kind of hidden away in Cripple Creek. So I think
social anxiety, I think, is in the 11th
there is
house.
She's whatever is in her chart. The first half of her life is very different to the second half.
Interesting. I can imagine as she gets older in the 70s, that's when Pluto enters Libra, like in the mid 70s through the beginning of the 80s. And at that point, she's going to be rethinking how she communicates with the world. And then by the mid 80s into the 90s, Pluto is going through her 4th house, which is where she lives, her family, her roots, who she is as a person. And it's hitting her moon and her Saturn. So I can imagine in the late 80s and the 90s, she's dealing with a lot. She's dealing with a lot of health problems. She's dealing with a lot of probably fear and anxiety, more so than she had when she was younger. And Pluto was going through her 1st house, in the 70s, where she's like charging ahead into fame and fortune. When did she end up passing away?
1995. She dies on 21st October 1995.
Okay. So that's either when Pluto is in her 4th house or her 5th house. Actually, I think by that time, Pluto's in her 5th house. So I don't know if like towards the end of her life, she was putting a lot of effort into trying to find out what happened with her daughter. But that would be really interesting. And also, she was going through in the 90s, Saturn right on her descendant too. So she was having a lot of outer planet hitting her chart in really hard ways towards the end of her life, which I'm sure just caused her to focus less on the outside world and more on the internal world.
I mean, she in the 90s, she was still looking for Sally. Her friend, who's posted a big thing about her, said that by 1993, they figured out that Sally was no longer on the planet.
And that's a very Pluto in your 5th house sort of experience, dealing with, I must now accept that my child has died and come to terms with that and process that. And
yeah, I mean, she was writing a book about her search for Sally.
Oh, wow. So that's also a very Pluto in the 5th house, because it's the 5th house is the creative things that you make, but also your children. I bet that book never got finished because she passed away too soon.
It's supposedly in good hands, like somebody's got it and is protecting it.
Okay. It would be really interesting to see what she wrote and what she found and all of that.
But as I say, I think there are certain things that, time goes by and a veil gets drawn over them. And we live in a culture that wants to know everything now. We like to feel we can just Google something and get a quick fact. But that's not the case. And as I said, originally a lot of astrological knowledge was in the realm of the occult, the deliberately hidden, and it is now in the mainstream. The very simplified versions of it are in the mainstream, because actually to do astrology properly, you need a pretty expert skill set, as you always have done.
Yeah.
But maybe there's some karmic balance there, that Linda brought things into the light that were not meant to be in the light.
Or maybe there's like a constant cycle in the universe of bringing things into the light and then things being occulted again.
Yeah, because she brought things into the light, things were hidden from her.
That's a very Mercury in the 12th house thing, too. You are doing things, you don't know why. Other people are experiencing the karmic results of what you're doing, but you don't really see what impact you're having on the rest of the world. And there's this you could just kind of picture a wheel in water, and like half that wheel is always underneath the water as the other half is going into the air.
Yeah.
Half the wheel is going into the light while the other half is going to the darkness. And that is knowledge and wisdom that's constantly circling. And we don't get to ever see the full wheel. I don't know, that's a metaphor I just made up, but it kind of explains, I think, Linda's life. She illuminated some things for some people, but a lot of things were made hidden for herself. Anything else before we wrap things up?
No, I think Linda's a fascinating figure, and yeah, maybe, but I don't know where you go to get information about Sally.
It was, pre-internet thing, so you can't really.
Yeah, you'd have to get into Linda's papers or find an illicit copy of The Spider Line, which is the book she wrote. I
wonder if someone in her friend or family circle still has that out there. I hope it doesn't get thrown out in the trash when they pass away or something.
But, I think there's still enough interest in Linda that they wouldn't. But, as a historian, part of my work involves working with archives, and I know how much stuff
just gets thrown away,
lost and discarded. Yeah. But again, it's that wheel. You save some things, you lose some things.
So what are you working on? Are you looking forward to anything coming up?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to find me on my Substack, The Haunted Path, come over there and subscribe. It's been a bit quiet because I've been working on various other things that I cannot talk about. I would love to say I have lots of news, but nothing tangible.
I'm at the tail end of a very epic episode on Poncho Barnes. I just need to write up the end part of it, but I'm really looking forward to recording that soon. Poncho Barnes, the test pilot, stunt pilot woman who broke a lot of records and lived a very chaotic, amazing, adventurous life And I'm looking forward to sharing her story. And this is Haunted Hollywood Hour. If you've enjoyed any of this, definitely leave us a rating and a review. Share it with your friends. If you have a request for anything that you'd like talked about on this podcast, email it to hauntedhollywoodhour@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram at Haunted Hollywood Hour Podcast, all one word. Until next time, bye.